His flatulence became the stuff of legend, transforming from a simple bodily function into something that terrified an entire continent. Medieval scribes documented the infamous deeds of Weslas IV of Bohemia, the king whose noxious emissions were said to have wiped out nearly 100 seasoned scouts. That smell, it wasn't just unpleasant, it was caustic, almost tangible, a suffocating fog that brought men to their knees and turned the royal court into a chamber of agony. Never before had a monarch ruled with such an unusual kind of fear, where dread came not from armies but from the foulness that lingered in his wake. But this story raises some compelling questions. How did such a powerful stench come to represent his strength as a ruler? How did Courtier survive that relentless haze? And most of all, why do people still whisper his name in fear, even today? Make no mistake, this isn't some clever fabrication. It's a disturbingly real part of history. To those of you still listening, your determination is as strong as iron. The roots of this bizarre legend reach all the way back to the king's youth. Weslas IV was a man with a boundless appetite. For him, every meal felt like a feast. Towering plates of cabbage, sizzling sausages by the dozen, omelets packed with eggs, and tankards topped with frothy foam. The sauces were rich with garlic, and sometimes even the milk carried the wild scent of a wandering goat. As dusk settled, the halls echoed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Weslas spared no effort in hosting grand dinners. At the center of every gathering stood a steaming cauldron overflowing with stewed beans. While the nobles tried to hide their discomfort behind forced smiles, the tension in the air was unmistakable. They endured with a silent understanding. The king's word is law. The servants quickly learned that there was no candle nor aromatic herb that could mask the king's aftermath. In fact, this ordeal sparked a dark sense of humor among the court. Soon, brave souls began to wager on who could withstand the suffocating fumes in the king's chamber, the longest after the feasting ended. Soon, inventive remedies began to appear. People wore crude masks made from scraps of cloth, sometimes soaked in lavender, to dull the stench. Noblewomen quietly dabbed their handkerchiefs with perfume, while footmen tucked dried berries between their teeth, desperate to keep their nausea at bay. Weslas found all this amusing. He liked to say with pride, "Where there is an aroma, there is vitality." Any courtier foolish enough to wrinkle their nose or turn away would face his wrath, sometimes a sharp rebuke, other times outright banishment. But the king's favorite amusement was far more disturbing. In the town's public square, he created a notorious spectacle. He would summon the 5 most striking young women and arrange them before him in a perfect arc. The rules of his game were brutally simple. Endure the onslaught without pinching your nose or collapsing. As the king unleashed his toxic clouds, the contest quickly weeded out the faint-hearted. Anyone seen gagging or turning pale was quietly ushered away. The last woman standing received a handsome reward, a purse heavy with silver, and, for better or worse, a night in the king's quarters. Word spread quickly. Those who survived this ordeal were said to have nerves of steel, forever unflappable. On certain days, Weslas would dictate a menu designed to make the coming trials even tougher. Mondays meant sharp sauerkraut. Wednesdays mixed hard-boiled eggs with pungent garlic. Fridays brought beans tangled with rich smoked meat. Each day of the week came with its own unique scent, and the royal guards took it upon themselves to warn newcomers, avoid the throne room today. The court physicians tried to explain the overpowering smell as a sign of internal heat, but their advice was weak. Herbal teas and cooling wraps did little to offer relief from the king's powerful fumes. Yet, the king simply scoffed at his court physicians. He pulled them closer and ordered them to breathe in near his bare stomach. "Feel the very force that sustains me," he said, his voice filled with strange pride. Over time, their laughter faded. It was slowly replaced by a reluctant respect, even awe. Weslas insisted, "As long as this breath lingers within, life stays with me. Should it vanish, so do I." Not a single person dared challenge him. Inside the palace of Venus the 40th, every detail was carefully controlled, especially the air. Heavy drapes sealed the windows. Thick pelts covered the entryways. All of this was done to trap the infamous presence of their sovereign. The hallways became softer under thick carpeting, dulling any sound and masking the king's overwhelming presence. New servants were given stern advice as soon as they entered. "Keep your mouth open." Never show your distress if you want to last. Very few lasted through their first week. Most collapsed where they stood. Those who survived either lost their sense of smell completely or learned the lesson so well that it stayed with them forever. Dining with Weslas was a true test of willpower. Every guest who stepped into the palace eyed the coveted seats by the windows, desperate for a breath of fresh air. But the king had his own ideas. He gathered his most influential guests close, making sure that no person of rank could leave his side. Beer was served in huge casks, cabbage piled high on every platter, and the sharp smell of garlic sauce filled the air, growing so thick it seemed to weigh on everyone's chest. As night fell, Vince would unleash his infamous gusts, a noise so wild, the court musicians would rush to play louder, their music rising in a desperate attempt to cover the sound. Yet nothing could drown out the overpowering force that swept through the chamber in an instant. Guests pressed their hands to their faces. Knights jumped up from their seats, some even collapsing with flair, vowing to leave court life for good. But those tied to royal duty endured in silence. Dark humor spread throughout the land. Whispers warned if you wished for an early grave, dine with Vince Los, or it's not an enemy's arrow you should fear, but the king's throne room. Servants frantically rubbed strong spirits onto their mustaches, chewed peppercorns or herbs, while ladies tucked sachets of mint beneath their gowns. But no trick or preparation brought any relief. No one lasted long in the king's presence when he decided to assert his authority. His counselors often took the worst of it. Fences enjoyed staging mock interrogations, a cruel performance where he would loom over his advisors, watching as fear and disgust drained the color from their faces. In one infamous council session, Weslas leaned back on his throne and released a blast so powerful that the candle flames flickered out one by one. At that very moment, a longtime advisor slumped forward face first into a steaming dish of roast. Without a word, the servants quietly removed him from the room. The king let out a smug laugh. Such is the might of my inner fire. Tales from the palace quickly became the stuff of darkly comic proverbs and chilling children's warnings. Disobey, and you'll end up feasting with Weslas. In the shadowy corners of taverns, whispers grew louder. Some claimed the devil himself helped Weslas poison his enemies. Beyond the borders, his legend only grew stranger. They called him the Gas King. The ruler of Hungary once said, "Better to lose your own nose than to risk a seat at Weslas's table." A tongue-in-cheek gift arrived from Poland, a gilded mask, complete with a nose plug and an inscription that read, "For noble guests." Conditions inside the royal halls became so unbearable that major reconstruction was unavoidable. Weslas ordered a gleaming silver throne to be made with a hole in the center and a bowl of charcoal underneath, meant to catch and trap the fumes. But even with these unusual inventions, the problem lingered. One courtier joked that Bohemia now had two crowns, one golden and the other, well, reeking. The king ignored the physicians and their desperate remedies. Doctors would bring their potions and salves, but Weslas demanded more. He insisted they inhale the fumes from his so-called treatments, showing off his power. Anyone who couldn't handle it was quickly banished from the palace. Rumors spread that a healer was once forced to press his face near the royal refuse. Even the king fainted from being that close, but Venus only scoffed. "There is no place here for the faint-hearted," she said. Meanwhile, Weslas's feats on horseback became legendary in their own right. Stories swept across Bohemia of the king racing through city streets atop his horse, unleashing his infamous power at full speed and leaving shocked onlookers behind. The king's steed charged ahead with such force, it seemed as if a storm itself was pushing him forward. Legend had it that, after each ride, a hole was burned clean through the saddle where the royal wind had struck. Children argued passionately about whether these tales were true, while palace staff insisted that no horse ever volunteered to carry the king a second time. At dusk, Weslas would gaze down from his throne, cloaked in his unmistakable vapor. He was utterly convinced that true authority meant everyone recognized your very scent. In his eyes, that dread carried more weight than any blade. What started as a minor palace nuisance soon became Bohemia's shared affliction. The king's odor worked its way into letters from foreign ambassadors, the journals of traveling wanderers, even in merchant ledgers and warnings. Everywhere the message was the same: be wary. If Weslas's court draws near, do not open the windows. The misery spread far beyond the castle walls. Soon, guests at nearby inns began to complain. The blight of Weslas's presence was impossible to escape. Whenever the royal party traveled through the countryside, neighboring villages braced for impact. Windows stayed shuttered for days, sometimes even weeks. Innkeepers, desperate, would wring vinegar-soaked cloths, hoping to block out the overwhelming stench. Diplomats from distant lands, summoned to the court of the Windy Sovereign, pleaded with their aides to secure French perfumes or powerful herbal balms. They clung to the hope that these preparations might help them endure the ordeal ahead. After an official visit, the English ambassador returned home. He immediately demanded that his suit be burned and even endured a plunge into icy water. In a letter, he confessed, "I would choose the chaos of battle over these infernal halls any day." Word spread quickly in Vienna and Warsaw. People whispered, "If war is coming, send Weslas to your enemy. Their defenses will crumble." Weslas, for his part, thrived on this notorious reputation. He turned testing his courtiers' endurance into an unusual game, organizing contests to see who could stay the longest in his private chambers. No pinched noses allowed. Special contests were set aside just for the ladies of the court. They had their own unique role in this unusual game of endurance. At one particularly memorable royal ball, the king created a cruel new challenge. Each lady was asked to walk past him, holding her fan wide open and not allow her eyes to flicker even for a moment. The winner received a curious brooch shaped like a tiny bubble with a single drop of resin inside. It was a prize meant to capture the unforgettable scent of that night, but when it came to diplomatic affairs, the spectacle truly reached new heights. At a certain reception, the king was preparing to welcome János of Hungary, a man known for his legendary rivalry and playful banter with Weslas. Familiar with the Bohemian monarch's reputation, János made a bold entrance. He and his entire company arrived wearing masks, turning the event into something more like a masquerade at a plague hospital than a grand banquet. Just before entering the Great Hall, János swept off his mask with theatrical flair and declared, "They say your throne is as deadly as a gas chamber. Let's see whose company can last longer, mine or yours." Weslas responded with a sly smile, summoned his trusted champion, and signaled for the festivities to begin. Within half an hour, the scene inside had turned into an uproarious farce as both sides braced themselves for what was coming. The Hungarian advisors tried to keep their composure, some quietly holding their breath. Meanwhile, Bohemian servants exchanged knowing smirks, each waiting to see who would falter first. The stakes were high. Anyone who gave in would get a deduction from their pay. János remained steadfast until a particularly stunning blast erupted from the throne. The table candles flickered from the shockwave, and suddenly one of the Hungarian advisors rushed into the hallway, desperate for fresh air. Guests pressed themselves against the walls, desperate to escape the thickening cloud. But the king stood calm and unbothered. He raised his voice for all to hear. "The one who endures proves true strength." News of this bizarre duel quickly spread beyond Bohemia. The Duke of Poland even sent a golden nose plug as a playful tribute, while Czech merchants crafted an herbal remedy to guard against what they called the Bohemian plague. In the city, people joked that when the castle's stench drifted on the wind, it was time to shut the windows and keep the children inside. Undaunted, Weslas embraced his notorious odor, wearing it as a proud symbol of his dominance. Diplomats often complained that after an official visit to the castle, the only thing they could do was throw away their ruined clothes. Things took a darker turn when an Italian bishop collapsed right in front of the throne. The king, always eager for attention, declared it was the highest honor he could receive. To make the moment unforgettable, he even ordered a bucket of cabbage brine to be poured into the castles, well believing this would let his own strength soak into the very earth. But the most unsettling events happened out of sight, behind closed doors during secret councils. When the fate of the kingdom, war, or taxes hung in the balance, Weslas would hand out terrifying punishments to anyone who failed him. Once, a palace accountant missed an important deadline with the treasury. The king called him late at night to a cramped chamber, telling him to crouch by the door. Minutes passed, and the unfortunate official soon disappeared into a haze, his muffled groans the only sound beneath heavy piles of cloth. Eventually, guards dragged him out, barely conscious, gasping for clean air. Through all of this, Weslas firmly believed that his overpowering scent was a sign he was meant to rule. Once, in a defiant burst of pride, Weslas declared to his courtiers, "My stench is my life. As long as I have it, no one will conquer me." His unusual philosophy quickly spread throughout the kingdom, finding its way into bawdy verses and whispered tales. People spoke of a breathing throne, a king whose very presence was said to simmer with something more dangerous than death itself. Still, these satirical songs were risky to repeat. Anyone caught singing them could end up in the dungeons. Yet, among all the legends, one especially outrageous event was officially recorded by the city. During a bustling festival, the king rode into the square. With a single dramatic gesture, he unleashed a cloud so powerful that even a stray dog went wild, sending the whole crowd into chaos. In the rush to escape the commotion, one poor soul even tumbled right into the fountain. Afterwards, merchants argued for days about which was worse, the lingering plague or Weslas's sudden visit. But the king, eager to relive his moment of glory, told the story to every newcomer, never missing a beat and always delighting in their disbelief. Remarkably, over time, the royal household didn't just put up with their ruler's unique aura, they accepted it as an unavoidable part of life. For anyone summoned to the palace, facing the king became a true trial of endurance. No subject ever dared confront him. After all, if his presence could weaken even the toughest ambassadors and hardened advisors, what chance did a real enemy have? The siege of King Wenceslas's castle would be remembered in history not as a tale of bravery, but as a spectacle of humiliation and farce. This story began one sweltering summer when soldiers from a neighboring land gathered outside the fortress walls. They expected no real resistance, believing that only servants dazed by fumes and courtiers cowed by fear were left inside. The commanders thought it would be an easy conquest, completely unaware of the unusual weapons the Windy Sovereign was preparing to unleash. From the very first days, Weslas cast aside the role of general and took on the mantle of a mystic warlock. The castle yard became the stage for strange rituals. Every shutter was barred, every door tightly locked. Rich tapestries covered the throne room, and the kitchens buzzed with an urgent energy. Something extraordinary and deeply unsettling was building inside those walls. Day and night, the castle kitchens buzzed with relentless activity. Cooks worked tirelessly over giant pots, simmering cabbage, beans, onions, garlic, and eggs. Barrels of beer were drained nearly as fast as they were filled. All the while, the king watched over every recipe, making sure each dish delivered maximum impact. No one could quite figure out the reason for this frantic preparation. But for those who knew Weslas's notorious strategies, the answer was obvious. As rumors spread, servants whispered tales of how the king, when faced with enemies at the gate, followed a single-minded regimen. For an entire day, he ate nothing but beans and cabbage, washing it down with the strongest cass. Then, he would demand piping hot goat's milk, spiked with garlic. By dawn, the air inside the palace was so thick, it nearly knocked out the kitchen staff. Guards patrolled the halls, each with a damp rag pressed to their face. Even the palace dogs, normally loyal to the very end, ran for shelter in the cellars. Meanwhile, the king, full of pride and determination, would mutter to anyone who came close, "Soon all will know who truly rules this castle." At last, the invaders forced their way into the castle and sent in a formidable squad of 89 scouts, each one handpicked for their skill and grit. With victory within sight, their confidence soared. But inside, King Wenceslas was waiting. He had barricaded himself, ready for what was to come. Moving with precise intent, he lured the enemy deeper into the suffocating heart of the fortress, the grand, stifling throne room. Its windows were boarded up, the air thick with humidity. As soon as the scouts crossed the threshold, Wenceslas gave the signal. The doors slammed shut behind them. His own attendants quickly scattered, leaving the invaders to their fate. What happened next could only be described as nightmarish. Inside that small, suffocating chamber, the air stuck to their skin, burning their eyes and throbbing in their heads. Disorientation swept through the group like a tidal wave. Some soldiers shouted in panic, some hammered at the locked doors, and others clawed desperately for even the slightest breath of fresh air leaking through cracks in the floor. But all their efforts failed. They were trapped in a thick, choking miasma so harsh and caustic it burned their throats and twisted their stomachs. Many immediately doubled over, hands pressed tightly to their faces, trying to block out the awful air. Some, desperate to escape, tore at their own shirts. Others simply collapsed where they stood, writhing on the ground as waves of nausea overtook them. Outside the sealed chamber, Wenceslas let out a jubilant cry, his smile broad with satisfaction. Surrounded by his most trusted henchmen, the king took twisted pleasure in the sounds of agony fading behind those thick walls. The toughest scouts tried to break through the boarded windows, but every possible route had already been sealed off. Within minutes, most of those once mighty soldiers lay sprawled and senseless or shuddering uncontrollably. Later, several survivors were carried out, barely clinging to consciousness. Their faces were swollen, drenched in sweat, and completely drained of color. Whispers spread through the camp. Some had suffocated in their own sickness. Others had lost the power of speech forever. No sword was drawn, and no arrow flew. The king's dreadful presence had achieved what armies could not. Finally, when the groans inside faded, uneasy servants slowly opened the doors. The stench burst out in a rush so strong that even those in the courtyard pinched their noses and ran. That was the moment the besiegers were truly defeated. Victory wasn't won with swordplay or by acts of bravery atop the ramparts. Instead, it came from a suffocating ambush. No one could outlast the king's fierce, deadly fumes. Afterwards, stories of Weslas spread in every direction, wrapped in both reverence and dread. The royal forces earned their terrifying reputation, not through skill at arms, but thanks to an unmatched and invisible weapon. No shield could block it. No warrior could withstand it. Foreign diplomats sent dire warnings home if conflict ever returned to Bohemia. No one inside those fortress walls would survive. Death, carried by the very air, was inevitable. Even the old chroniclers, reluctant as they were, admitted this was the only campaign ever won, not by courage, but by an unstoppable stench. After the ordeal, the king threw a lavish celebration in his honor. Surrounded by his loyal survivors and comrades, he raised his goblet high and proclaimed, "It was my stench that saved Bohemia today." Remember this, well, terror travels first upon the wind. No one dared challenge his words. That night, new torches burned bright atop the castle, not as beacons of victory, but in the desperate hope that their flames might chase away the last traces of that dreadful aroma. But for weeks, that infamous odor lingered. Travelers passing near the castle grounds would never forget the place where an army had fallen, defeated by a monarch's unimaginable power. As time passed, Weslas IV's reign slipped into isolation and relentless loneliness. Years of indulgence had finally caught up with him. His body swelled grotesquely, and each breath became a struggle. His skin lost its color, sagging into a sickly shade. Sweat dotted his brow, even as the chill crept through the great stone corridors. Physicians came and went, each offering different advice. Some recommended laxatives for relief, others prescribed herbal brews to cleanse his blood. But everyone knew deep down that none of these remedies could truly help the king. His compulsions were too strong, food and drink never left his side, and he took an odd comfort in his own pungency. Human contact became more difficult for him. Even those with once unwavering loyalty started to keep their distance, wary of his unpredictable temper. Anyone who challenged his habits faced humiliation. In his final days, Weslas saved his harshest cruelty for those bold enough to question his way of life. In the twilight of Weslas's rule, only a few loyal companions remained by his side. They chose silence over confrontation, their devotion worn thin after years of endurance. But the true heartbreak was reserved for the women who were meant, perhaps doomed, to be his brides. Long ago, when Weslas was young and full of ambition, he dreamed of building a great bloodline. But every marriage ended in disaster. His first bride, a noble countess from Moravia, spent her wedding night in a chamber so foul that by morning she was found barely conscious, gasping for air. Within days, she returned home, wild-eyed and silent, forever changed by what she had endured. The second and third noblewomen suffered even more, overcome with fits of retching. They had to be carried from the castle by servants before their vows could be exchanged. News of these misfortunes spread quickly. When the fourth would-be queen heard from friends about the horrors she might face, she begged her family to call off the engagement. The fifth, a daughter of a powerful Austrian duke, barely made it through the night. She survived, but it took weeks for her to recover from the shock. Finally, one last candidate disappeared altogether, fleeing before her wedding night ever arrived. One bride to be watched in horror as servants rushed to fling open every window and douse the royal bed with incense, all in the desperate attempt to mask the heavy, suffocating odor. Overwhelmed by panic, she screamed and fled into the night garden, leaving chaos behind her. Soon, gossip spread like wildfire across Europe. The cruel joke was, if you wish misery upon your daughter, send her to Vences. Biting rhymes and mocking songs echoed to the city streets, portraying the Bohemian king not as a wooer, but as a man who strangled the very life from his brides. In his final years, Weslas could barely shuffle through the castle's corridors, confined to his feather-stuffed bed. Though his hunger for food never faded, his body finally gave in to exhaustion. The loud and joyful banquets were now just memories. Horseback rides had become impossible. Day after day, he lay sprawled on his mattress, demanding more food. Physicians pleaded for him to let in fresh air, but the king was terrified that opening a window would let his very spirit escape. Servants burned herbs and incense to mask the odor, and always slept as far from him as they could. In the end, his passing came quietly, wrapped in sorrow. It was a night buzzing with the usual calls for sauerkraut and beer, when suddenly a violent seizure struck. In that moment, the king passed away, leaving behind a final note of scandal. His body shook with fierce tremors, his face turning a deep, ominous purple. Each breath came out as a harsh, animalistic howl. As the end drew near, a loyal servant rushed to his side, only to hear a deafening guttural sound, one so startling it echoed through the corridors louder than any cannon. And so the legend goes, time itself seemed to freeze. Vences died atop his throne, surrounded by heavy silence and cloaked in his own infamous scent. His burial was shrouded in secrecy. In the darkness of night, his coffin was whisked away, covered in quicklime, and buried much deeper than tradition required, just to keep his scent from rising through the earth. Yet, in the kingdom's shadows, whispers persisted. Whenever the northern wind blew, people claimed it was the king himself, once again wielding his unseen weapon. Children frightened each other with ghostly tales of the gas king. Chroniclers wrote their final verdict. He conquered not with swords, but with the very air, and the air endures. No monarch's legacy lingered so powerfully.